Okay. Hi, I'm here with Dr. Parancalser, and I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself, and I'm going to ask him a couple of questions regarding our legacy cycle.
All right, my name is Parancalser. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Texas, and I have my PhDs in the history and sociology of science, and I also have actually worked in the salmon canneries in Alaska for a couple of summers as a college student, along with many other college students and immigrants from Central America. Also work up there on a more lifetime basis, and some locals called lifers. So I have personal experience, and I love salmon.
Excellent.
To eat them and to admire them.
Okay, so what do you know about salmon farming?
Most of my knowledge about salmon farming comes just as a consumer, and through actually the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a thing on sustainable fisheries that they do, and then I've read a few papers and been to some academic talks on salmon farming too, and then from experience working in the fisheries, some sort of general knowledge that way. The salmon farming, as far as, I'm also from the West Coast and spent a lot of time in the Northwest. So from my perspective on salmon farming is extremely negative in terms of the potential for salmon farming in the Northwest outcompeting the natural wild salmon that live there, the potential for that, and diluting the genetic diversity of salmon stocks around the world. Of course, the salmon, I also am an admirer of the handling of the salmon fishery in the North Pacific in particular. I think it's handled very well and has produced a sustainable stock of salmon. Actually, salmon stocks are, it's little known, but salmon stocks are growing in the North Pacific, in Alaska, in certain areas.
And that is due to salmon farming?
No, that's not due to salmon farming. That's due to handling, a pretty good management of the fisheries and protection of salmon at the cost of maybe some other species. And maybe it could also have to do with, possibly, it's not clear, but it could have to do with salmon possibly moving from areas in Oregon and Washington, for example, that are where the environment is depleted to other areas. But I don't know if that's true or not.
Okay. You said that salmon farming may damage wild stocks. How is that?
Well, if they're introduced in the same area as wild fish, they ideally they're in nets and cages and aren't released into the wild at all. But in fact, they often escape and can outcompete fish for very limited resources, especially in the freshwater where they spawn.
So why would that be bad? Like if you're talking about one salmon outcompeting another salmon, aren't they still both salmon?
They are both salmon. They may not be as tasty, and they will tend to be more homogeneous in terms of their genetic diversity as another way to look at it, so that their genetic potentials that are going to be lost, and they can also outcompete with other species other than salmon that are out there. So there's a little bit of sentiment with appreciating the salmon that are historically in the Northwest, and then there's some real practical problems with just the very vigorous nature of some of the Atlantic salmon that are the ones that are farmed.
Okay, so they're farming Atlantic salmon in the Pacific Northwest?
No, they want to do that.
They want to do that.
I'm worried about that. I'm not sure if they are actually doing it yet or not.
Okay.
Not an expert in this area.
And as a consumer, is it just taste that I'm worried about as far as the difference between wild salmon and farmed?
For me, the taste is one factor. Some people, my father-in-law prefers Atlantic salmon, so that's just a matter of taste. But I'm actually much more concerned about the environmental impacts of the farming on other salmon populations, but then on ecosystems more generally too. And some fish and some types of fish are better to eat farmed than to eat wild caught, but it's just not that way with salmon.
Can you touch upon some of the environmental impacts of farming?
Well, there's the waste that the salmon produce, the feces that they put into the water. There are the salmon themselves have to be fed, and so those takes up more resources than the wild caught salmon. They eat the fish that are also wild and swimming in that area. There's the possibly out competing other species of salmon or other types of fish that are around. And then there's possibly health factors with salmon too for human populations, depending on how the fish are raised and fed. So those are all impacts.
Okay. What ways would they be raised and fed that would be potentially harmful to a consumer?
Well, once we get into details, we're going to quickly be outstripping my knowledge base, and I'll be speculating because this is not actually an area that I've personally studied. So, as a consumer of salmon and some information about salmon, my understanding is that the fish can be dyed, they can be fed antibiotics, and these other sorts of things that either the risks aren't known or that do carry some potential risks. On the other hand, wild-caught salmon are fairly high up in the food chain and can consume a fair amount of mercury, maybe. So that could be another problem.
Okay, and what is a stakeholder? Can you give me a definition of a stakeholder?
Now we're entering into an area that I do know more about. A stakeholder is someone with a stake in the problem or the issue at hand. Stakeholders in this case would be the people that the consumers of the salmon do have a stake in it. The people who use the ecosystem that the salmon live in for economic or leisure purposes would have a stake in this issue. Obviously the fishermen are included there, and the businesses that are running the farms would have a stake in this. Environmentalists would have a stake in the issue potentially. Often government officials are not seen as stakeholders in this sort of a thing. They're sort of ideally neutral arbiters in what's going on. That's sort of a useful fiction, I think, in terms of policy making. And biologists, especially as scientists, tend to take on a somewhat activist role historically. Ecologists, for example, in particular, and oceanographers, and while they are often also sort of a fictional neutral party in this, they actually often have a stake in advocating for the fish or the ecosystem more generally.
Okay, well, we're kind of focusing on the salmon farming in Chile right now. Do you know anything about what's going on down there?
I know just a little about it from an NPR report I heard on the radio and from a great lesson that was given in my class about this. So I have my knowledge of Chilean salmon farming is equivalent to my knowledge of salmon farming other places, which is pretty superficial.
Okay, but it would be okay to think about that the problems that we're facing regarding salmon farming in the North Hemisphere would be similar to the ones that we would be facing in the Southern Hemisphere.
They are with in the Pacific, where in the Pacific the issues are replacing one species of salmon with another species of salmon potentially, or the risk of that. There's already sort of an ecological niche where salmon live. In Chile, salmon are obviously not native to Chile at all, and for me that would create a whole different set of related but a different in kind set of questions when you're introducing a totally new species to an area. And also there's an established salmon fishery in the Pacific that can defend its interests. It's a strong, rich stakeholder, and I'm not sure that an equivalent exists with the fisheries in Chile.
And can you name some benefits to salmon farming?
obviously, when you go to the grocery store, there's most of the salmon that you find is farm salmon, so it's producing a lot of salmon, and people like salmon. It's an extremely healthy food to eat if it doesn't have contaminants in it anyway, which generally is not a fish that's high on the list of ones to worry about. So it brings a lot of economic activity and a lot of pleasure to consumers. So yeah, there's definitely significant benefits to salmon farming in that sense. I personally don't ever eat farmed salmon.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Seltzer.
Sure.
I really appreciate it.